The melee system seems very simplistic at first glance, but when you peer under the hood, it turns out to be the most complicated part of the combat system. This video aims to help you understand those complexities and be better equipped to choose the right weapons for your pawns. If you enjoy this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. It isn't enough just to compare the listed DPS on different weapons. Each melee weapon has multiple types of attacks that can be performed with it. For example, the spear has 3 attacks, 2 with the shaft that deal blunt damage, and 1 with the spear tip that deals sharp damage. This is where the melee verb system comes in. Each attack is categorized as a verb. Verbs are split into 3 categories: best, mid, and worst. Which category an attack is placed within is dependent on the damage it does relative to the other attacks. The higher the damage, the higher the category. Verbs that are put into the best category will be chosen 75% of the time, and those in the mid category will be chosen 25% of the time. Worst verbs will never be chosen. That means a pawn will be attacking with its best attacks the majority of the time. Referring back to our 3 verbs for the spear, the point will be used 75% of the time, the shaft poke will be performed 12.5% of the time, and the shaft blunt will be used 12.5% of the time. In this scenario, the pawn's fist will be put in the worst category and will occur 0% of the time while the spear is equipped. This percentage array will change if you add implants. So keep this in mind when you're comparing the tooltip for 2 different weapons. For the sake of this guide, when I talk about the average DPS and average armor penetration, it will be referring to the weighted average of the melee verbs, not the listed DPS on the tooltip in the game. You can find all of the weighted averages on the RimWorld wiki for each weapon. It's important to start off by distinguishing between the different damage types. Aside from the exception of the Plasmasword's extra fire damage, all melee weapons will use either blunt or sharp damage. Keep in mind that most weapons will have verbs for both blunt and sharp damage. Only weapons like the Mace, Warhammer, and Zeushammer will be exclusively blunt damage. Let's first take a look at blunt damage. When you destroy a body part with blunt damage, the damage can continue on to the parent body part. For example, if you destroy an arm, the damage can continue on to the torso. If you damage a body part that has no parent, for example the head or torso, there's a chance to stun the target. In addition to this, if you damage the brain, there's a significantly higher chance to stun. The stun in both cases lasts 0.66 seconds. Blunt damage is generally preferred against high armor targets, due to the fact that all armor has much higher sharp protection value than blunt protection value. Now let's take a look at sharp damage. Sharp damage is preferred against low armor targets for a few reasons. It has higher base DPS. In addition to this, cut attacks can cause a cleave effect that will hit multiple locations. And pierce attacks have a chance to penetrate the parent body part to hit internal organs. When a piercing attack hits an internal organ, it will be split between the organ and the parent body part. For example, if a pierce attack hits the liver, it will split the damage between the liver and the torso. If it hits the brain, it will split the damage between the brain and the head. The cleave effect that can be caused by cut attacks will cause multiple locations to be targeted, and the damage will be split evenly between those locations. If a cut attack hits the arm and continues to cleave into the torso, the damage will be split evenly between the arm and the torso. This oftentimes will mean that the arm is less likely to be destroyed in the process. Let's add a bit of further context to the distinction between sharp and blunt. Let's take a look at a couple armor examples. A centipede has 72% sharp armor while only having 22% blunt armor. A termite has 56% sharp armor while only having 22% blunt armor. A pirate wearing normal quality marine armor will have 106% sharp armor while only having 45% blunt armor. And pirates wearing a normal quality flak jacket and vest have 40% sharp armor and 8% blunt armor on the outer layer, while having 100% sharp and 36% blunt on the middle layer. In our examples, you can see that all of these armor targets are going to be significantly worse at protecting against blunt damage rather than sharp damage. If you're confused as to what these numbers mean, I'd recommend watching my Armor Explained video that explains how armor protection works. I'll leave a link to that video in the description. The first of our melee weapons that we're going to discuss is the Longsword. When made out of plasteel or bioferrite, the Longsword makes for a decent early to mid-game option. Bioferrite has a slightly higher sharp damage modifier for weapons compared to plasteel at 130% for bioferrite and 110% for plasteel. On the other hand, plasteel has a slightly lower melee cooldown modifier at 80% versus bioferrite's 100%. Keep in mind, bioferrite is only available if you're using the Anomaly DLC. If you do have Anomaly, then bioferrite is considerably easier to acquire compared to plasteel, making it a favorable option for spam crafting to acquire higher quality weapons. The Longsword has 3 attack verbs: a handle poke, a stab, and a cut. With these melee verbs, a normal quality plasteel Longsword has an average DPS of 10.37 and an average armor penetration of 31.03, while the bioferrite Longsword of the same quality has an average DPS of 9.99 and an average armor penetration of 36.13. The stab counts as a pierce, meaning that it has an increased chance of hitting internal organs, and thus a higher chance of causing instant death when it connects with a low health critical organ. The cut attack has a chance to cleave, going through one body part and damaging another. The damage that the cleave attack does will be split between the affected areas. This means that it is less likely to completely destroy limbs before pain shock threshold downs the pawn. Cleave is one of the reasons why you may prefer the longsword over the spear. The downside of the longsword is that it's going to suffer against high armor opponents until you start to get to the higher qualities. Bioferrite will have higher armor penetration across the board when compared to the plasteel version. A Bioferrite longsword will have 72.93% armor penetration at legendary quality, compared to only 51.11% for the plasteel longsword. The second of our melee weapons is the spear. The spear is comparable to the longsword when used against unarmored targets, and each will have its own pros and cons for this usage. It's also a competitor to the mace for higher armor targets. You'll want to craft your spears out of either plasteel or bioferrite. Assuming you're using Anomaly, Bioferrite will allow you to spam craft spears until you can acquire several very high quality options. Plasteel on the other hand is significantly harder to acquire, making it a lesser option for mass crafting. On top of this, the spear also benefits from Bioferrite's higher armor penetration. I'd recommend going with Bioferrite unless you don't have Anomaly, in which case Plasteel would be the clear choice for material. The spear has 3 melee verbs, 2 blunt attacks with a shaft, and 1 piercing attack with a point. With these melee verbs, a normal quality plasteel spear has an average DPS of 10.53 and an average armor penetration of 45.75. The best melee verb of a normal quality plasteel spear has armor penetration of 55%, and a Bioferrite spear has 65%. Both of these are quite substantial, even against high armor targets. Compare this to a centipede's sharp armor at 72%. This leaves the centipede with an effective armor value of only 22% for the plasteel spear and 7% for the Bioferrite spear. This improves significantly as the quality of the spear improves. Only one of the 3 verbs is high damage, which leaves us with only one best verb. Going back to our verb basics, this means 75% of attacks with it will be that main high damage attack. Because this main verb is a piercing attack, it has a higher chance of hitting internal organs. If you hit the heart, liver, or brain, it can cause instant death. The third of our melee weapons is the mace. In addition to the longsword and the spear, the mace is one of the best melee weapons in the base game. The only material that's worth using when it comes to blunt weapons is uranium. When you make a mace out of uranium, it gets a bonus to blunt damage of 150%, but increases melee cooldown by 110%. It has 2 melee verbs, poke with the handle, and a blunt strike with the head of the mace. That means that the mace can only perform blunt attacks. With these melee verbs, a normal quality uranium mace has an average DPS of 9.3 and an average armor penetration of 30.63%. When you combine the respectable base DPS with the fact that most enemies have very little armor against blunt, this gives you a very solid weapon for your melee characters. For example, as I mentioned previously, a centipede only has 22% blunt armor. A normal quality uranium mace's primary attack has an armor penetration of 24%, meaning a centipede has no effective armor against the primary attack of the mace. One last note about the mace: since it deals blunt damage, it has a chance to stun whenever it deals damage to a parentless body part or the brain. In both cases, the stun lasts 0.66 seconds. The fourth of our melee weapons is the Warhammer. The Warhammer requires the royalty DLC in order to craft in your colony. Just like the mace, it is best to stick to uranium as your material of choice. The Warhammer is very similar to the mace, but you get higher damage in exchange for slower attack speed. But this does leave you with lower DPS overall. I personally prefer the mace's higher attack speed and DPS, but there is a reasonable argument to be made for the Warhammer's faster time to kill against humanoids. At masterwork or higher quality, this weapon can consistently 1 or 2 shot humanoid enemies. That being said, if you're looking for a higher lethality against humanoids, then you're better off going with the longsword or the spear. The Warhammer has the same attack verbs as the mace, giving it only blunt damage as an option. With these melee verbs, a uranium normal quality Warhammer has an average DPS of 9.29 and an average armor penetration of 37.75%. It does have slightly higher armor penetration, but since you are already checking against blunt armor, which is always low, this is not a large advantage compared to the mace. Since the Warhammer deals blunt damage, it has a chance to stun whenever it deals damage to a parentless body part or the brain. In both cases, the stun lasts 0.66 seconds. The next 3 melee weapons that we're going to talk about are considered ultra tech and cannot be crafted by your colonists. The first is the Monosword. It's the best melee weapon type of the royalty DLC. It has a large amount of damage and one of the highest armor penetration values of any melee weapon in the game. It's essentially a powered up longsword. For specifics on the advantages of swords, refer back to the longsword section of this video. The Monosword has 3 melee verbs: a blunt attack with the handle, a stab with the point, and a cut with the edge. With these melee verbs, a normal quality Monosword has an average DPS of 11.45 and an average armor penetration of 72%. This massive armor penetration is where the Monosword truly shines. The Persona variant of the Monosword is arguably the best melee weapon in the game, giving both substantially higher DPS and armor penetration, but also providing unique abilities depending on which type of Persona you find. The next of our 3 Ultra Tech weapons is the Plasmasword. It deals sharp damage with bonus fire damage, and the chance to set the target on fire. It's decent against biological targets, but generally weak in comparison to the Monosword. When an enemy is set on fire by the Plasmasword, it will run around uncontrollably, meaning that it can be used as a form of crowd control. The Plasmasword has all of the same melee verbs as the Monosword. With these melee verbs, a normal quality Plasmasword has an average DPS of 7.39 and an average armor penetration of 27.5%. This includes only the melee damage and not the fire damage. As fun as this weapon sounds, the only time I use the Plasmasword is when I find a Persona version with powerful Persona traits. Otherwise, longswords, spears, and maces are going to be the preferable option. The last of our 3 Ultra Tech weapons is the Zeushammer. It has the benefit of dealing blunt damage, thus being more effective against targets with high, sharp armor, but it has the disadvantage of having a weak, short duration EMP stun that shares adaptation immunity with all other forms of EMP. This means that you'll be unable to stun with longer duration stuns if you're using a Zeushammer, given that the stun from Zeushammers will almost always apply first before the stuns from other sources like EMP grenades or EMP launchers. The stun for the Zeushammer only lasts 4.5 seconds on mechs. Compare this to EMP grenades that have a stun of 25 seconds. The stun on the EMP launcher scales with quality and goes all the way up to 37.5 seconds. Since they all share adaptation, and adaptation lasts for 36.67 seconds, this means that the Zeushammer is by far the worst option for stunning mechs, and it's going to stop you from using those better options. The Zeushammer has the same melee verbs as the Mace and Warhammer. With these melee verbs, a normal quality Zeushammer has an average DPS of 9.41 and an average armor penetration of 38.33. Much like the Plasmasword, unless you find an especially powerful Persona Zeushammer, I would lean toward using a Mace, a Warhammer, or a Spear over any Zeushammer. The last thing we're going to discuss in this video are the melee implants. Due to the melee verb system, it is not always a positive benefit to add a melee implant onto a melee character. It is possible that by adding a new mid-category verb, you lower the frequency of other more potent mid-category verbs, causing a net loss in DPS. This was supposed to be addressed in a previous patch, but unfortunately the problem persists. Because of this, I find the best way to implement melee implants is actually on your range pawns. This gives them a potent melee option if an enemy does close the distance and engages them in melee combat. For many of the following options, the implant is equivalent to equipping your ranged pawns with an additional normal quality steel longsword. One very important thing to remember is that these implants are incompatible with prosthetics and bionics that fit the same body part as the implant. The knee spike's only melee verb is stab. This piercing attack gives an average DPS of 8.46 and an armor penetration of 38%. Since it's a piercing attack, it gives the benefit of increased chance to hit vital organs. It is lower DPS than the elbow blade and the hand talon, but the significant armor penetration makes it more effective against higher armor targets. The elbow blade's only melee verb is cut. This gives the elbow blade an average DPS of 9 and an armor penetration of 27%. Given that it is a cut, it has the benefit of having a chance to cleave. It is also a compromise between the hand talon's DPS and the knee spike's armor penetration, giving you a decent middle ground melee implant. The hand talon's only melee verb is scratch. This gives the hand talon an average DPS of 10 and a relatively low armor penetration of 15%. Although the hand talon is the highest DPS of the royalty DLC implants, it is going to be weaker against armored targets. The Power Claw isn't technically an implant as it completely replaces the hand, but it does function in the same way as all of the other melee implants. The Power Claw's only melee verb is scratch and is the highest DPS option of all of the melee implants at an average DPS of 11. It has an armor penetration of 33%, making it competitive with the knee spike against armored targets. But keep in mind, the Power Claw does impose a movement speed penalty of 8%. This not only affects how quickly your pawns move, but it also affects your pawn's chance to dodge. The last two implants are the Venom Fangs and the Venom Talon. These both deal sharp damage, but also build up toxicity in the target. Venom Fang's melee verb is Toxic Bite, and gives an average DPS at only 7.5 and a low armor penetration at 22%. Venom Talon's melee verb is Toxic Scratch, and has an average DPS of 7.33 and an even lower armor penetration at only 15%. You can use these to capture enemy pawns alive via toxic buildup. These are generally weaker than the other melee implants in terms of the overall damage dealt. I like Venom Fangs in particular because the one big advantage of using these is that you don't have to worry about them conflicting with prosthetics or bionics. This is not the case with Venom Talons, however, given that they fit on the middle finger. Thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.